Hello, Internet. I am Pastor Recoil, and welcome to my parish. Today is the third Sunday after Epiphany, and we're going to talk about it. Welcome to Pastor Recoil's Parish, where I talk about some things in the Bible that you may not have heard in church, either because it's not quite appropriate for all audiences, or it just isn't something that's easy to talk about in a sermon. Today's readings for the third Sunday after Epiphany are Nehemiah 8, 1-3, 5-6, and 8-10, Psalm 19, 1 Corinthians 12 through the first half of 31, and Luke 4, 16-30. I'm going to focus on Luke's gospel today because it's when some people try to kill Jesus. And no, not the time you're thinking about. Actually, to make it even worse, it's not just some people who try to kill Jesus. It's the people from Jesus' own hometown of Nazareth. Jesus moved around quite a bit as a kid. He was in Bethlehem for a year or two before having to flee to Egypt because yet another person was trying to kill him. That someone was King Herod the Great, a very paranoid ruler who was not pleased by the possibility of someone other than him being the king of the Judeans. After Herod the Great died, Jesus' family ended up in Nazareth, where his mom and step-ish dad lived before they had gone to Bethlehem. Jesus grew up there in Nazareth, and when he became an adult, he ended up moving about a day's journey away to a town called Capernaum. And there he started his teaching and preaching all around the region. After gaining a bit of a reputation in Capernaum, the synagogue in Nazareth was excited because their hometown kid, little Joshy Josephson, the carpenter's son, was going to preach to them. They're so proud. And everything started out great. Jesus stands up in the synagogue, he reads from Isaiah chapter 61, and as part of his teaching says, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled just as you heard it." And around a Christian church, you might recognize this process of reading from scripture and then having someone explain it. It's how Christian churches do things. It's how Jewish synagogues do things. It's actually seems to be kind of how a lot of religious groups do things. In this particular case, it makes sense that the process would be similar because early Christians were mostly Judeans. Jesus himself is a Judean. And so when the early Christian church was doing its thing, they continued some of the Judean practices that they knew. And you see kind of in Nehemiah's reading, that process is very old. Read scripture, then the teacher interprets it, and if they're any good, makes the scripture make sense. So Jesus must have been a pretty good teacher because the people thought what he was saying was great. They were all really impressed that the carpenter's kid was so good at teaching scripture. And the message was great. According to the scripture that Jesus said was fulfilled as they heard it, some really neat stuff is going to happen. First off, good news for the poor. Well, the Nazarenes probably are thinking, this is great. We're poor. This is good news for us. Next up is release from the prisoners. Hey, isn't Cousin Abraham locked up? Didn't the put him in jail? Oh yeah, get him out of there and we'll get back to the Roman stabbing. Yes. Okay, recovery of the sight to the blind. Okay, they might know somebody who's blind and think, that sounds pretty good too. At the very least, it's something that God's chosen one is supposed to do. It's kind of in line with all the rest of the stuff that little Joshy is trying to say he's going to fulfill. And then that last one, liberation of the oppressed. Well, the Nazarenes and really all of Judea is oppressed by those darn Romans. So, liberation for Judea. Go team. See why everyone's impressed. But Jesus had more to say. He wasn't done with his teaching yet. He kept going and said, "Oh, people, when there was a famine in Israel, Israel had many widows. But in 1 Kings 17, Elijah went to see a widow in Phoenicia, outside of Israel. And there was a whole bunch of people with skin diseases in the time of the prophet Elisha. But in 2 Kings 5, it was a Syrian general who was healed, somebody from outside of Israel." And that's when everybody got mad. They actually got really mad. They got so mad that they ran Jesus out of town and took him to a cliff where they were about to throw him off the cliff before Jesus Houdini'd himself out of there. See, they didn't like Jesus' point that this liberation that is fulfilled in Jesus isn't just something that's for one group of people. Now, they should have seen this coming. I mean, the stories of Elijah and Elisha going to people outside of Israel to heal them. And then we have in our readings for today this letter that Paul wrote to the church in Corinth in 1 Corinthians. And yes, it's written to a different group of people about 25 years after these events. But Paul really wasn't sharing any new ideas. He reminded people that we're all in this together. When one group or one individual suffers, we all suffer with them. When somebody is honored or someone rejoices, we all rejoice with them. Doesn't matter your race, your class, your income, your gender, or anything else. We're doing this life thing together as one human family. And this is something that really the first chapters of the first book in the Bible, the book of Genesis, make pretty clear. That we are all one human family. However different we all might seem to be. And even when one branch of that family is set apart and treated a little bit more special, the point is not so that they can just wallow in their own specialness, but it's so that they can take the blessing that they've received and be a blessing to others. But that's not usually what happens. How often do we see people get mad when they hear this? How often do we ourselves get mad when we hear this? Do you remember a couple years ago when there was a whole bunch of discussion about whether folk who are attracted to people of the same gender should be able to get married? It was really surprising to me how often the discussion came down to, well, if we let the gays get married, then it's gonna ruin it for the straights. It's like giving something to someone else takes it away from someone else. How often when someone says Black Lives Matter, is there inevitably someone else who chimes in with, well, all lives matter? It's not enough to just say this people group that hasn't historically mattered as much, or at least hasn't seemed to matter as much. To say that they matter the same as everyone else makes people mad. Or if we're dealing with the poor, we say, well, the government can't just give those people money. They might buy drugs or iPhones or fancy breakfasts with it. Now, of course, if you want to give me money from the government, that's fine. I deserve it, but not those people. And then when people start to bring these things up, it's amazing how quickly folk get so angry that it reaches the point of violence. We've seen that a lot over these past few years as well. We too often want nice things for ourselves, but we always seem to think that if other people get what we have, then it means what we have is going to be taken away. We don't want that. But these things are not a zero-sum game. Creating opportunities for people who are suffering, for people who are oppressed, doesn't take away anything from the people who aren't oppressed. It's not how it works. In fact, many studies have shown that, at least when it comes to the poor, giving them money seems to actually cost less to the people who aren't poor. But nobody wants to think about it like that. The people of Nazareth wanted to kill Jesus for saying that the good news of liberation is not just for one group of people, but it's for everyone. And now, many people, depressingly enough, many people who claim to follow Jesus would throw Jesus off a cliff all over again for daring to suggest that it isn't just good news for me, it's also good news for them. Now, if you want more content like this, check out the links to my right, or click the logo just below my face to subscribe so you'll know when my next video comes out. Thank you for watching, and take the time this week to love your neighbor as yourself, especially if you don't like them all that much.